Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Saturday, June 22nd, and today is day 260 since October 7th. I thought I would take a minute today and just give you an overarching summary of where things stand 9 months into the war on Gaza, what some call the genocide of Gaza, with the death tolls at more than 37,000 people. What else could we call it other than gross atrocities, where more than 240 hostages were taken on October 7th, with so much death and destruction happening. Months ago, we were talking to the Biden administration and US government officials about how if a comprehensive ceasefire and permanent solution were not demanded, were not pursued diligently, if everything wasn't done to hold Israel accountable for its atrocities against civilians in Gaza, that we could be on the precipice of a broader Middle East war. And by the grace of God, I hope we're wrong. But for those of us, for you who've been listening to my daily updates, we've always known and warned about the real and imminent threat and possibilities of broader escalations. We've been paying attention to the gross indiscriminate killings of civilians, and also the ways that's not brought into account. More than 500 deaths in the West Bank, more than 37,000 people killed in Gaza. And here we are today, and the Israeli military is on the precipice of a war with Hezbollah. And the US is saying that we will support Israel no matter what. I've heard supporters of the Biden administration say, I've heard people who support the way that the Biden administration has responded over the last 8 or 9 months say, what do I know? Or what do you know at Churches for Middle East Peace? And I want to say, we've been saying that if nothing is done, this could happen. And many of the things that we've said have come to be. And I hope we're wrong. I really hope we're wrong. But there has to be accountability. There has to be a comprehensive ceasefire immediately. There has to be an end to death and destruction. So I want to summarize some of the things we've been talking about over the last 8+ months. Biden's Security Memorandum 20. This demands that all countries that receive U.S. weapons and arms use them according to U.S. and international law. The conclusion about Israel's military use of U.S. weapons, what happened to all of that? Well, what happened to that was it was concluded that most likely Israel is in violation of U.S. law and nothing was done about it and no weapons were withheld. Okay, let's just keep going. April of this year, the application of the Leahy Laws, where the U.S. concluded that 5 Israeli divisions had committed gross human rights violations. 5 units of the Israeli military committed gross human rights violations and no U.S. weapons were withheld. None. And the reports were, but don't worry, those units self-corrected. And the news was reported and the Biden administration said, shouldn't we be impressed? This was the first time ever in history that the Leahy Law was applied to the Israeli government. And I just would say, what a farce. The Rafah invasion in early May, President Biden initially said that the US government would cut off weapons if there was a full-on invasion of Rafah. If that invasion preceded US weapons, if US weapons were used to kill civilians in Gaza, Biden acknowledged this on CNN. He said that if a full-scale invasion in the crowded city of Rafah continued, many more people would be killed, civilians would be vulnerable. This was the strongest language that President Biden had used in terms of holding Israel accountable for the death of civilians. He acknowledged that American bombs had killed innocent Palestinians. We'd hoped that the United States would put, a pause on weapon sales to the Israeli government. Heavy bombs that were having devastating effects on numbers of civilians in Gaza were paused, And then what happened? The Biden administration said, oh, it's not a full-scale ground invasion. And instead what happened was there wasn't a massive invasion all at once. There were smaller invasions. And instead of a massive invasion, the millions of people who've been displaced numerous times in Rafah were gradually displaced. So rather than one full-on invasion, there were dozens of smaller invasions that killed dozens of people or hundreds of people at a time. And we can't ignore the attack on June 8th at the Nuseirat refugee camp that was called a massacre. It killed at least 276 people. We can't ignore the fact that 800,000 people were displaced out of Rafah. They were displaced gradually But how is that not a full-scale ground invasion? That invasion of Rafah has been going on now for more than 6 weeks, since the beginning of May. And we talked about how if there was an invasion of Rafah, that we would have to be concerned that Hezbollah said if there's an invasion of Rafah, that Hezbollah would go to war with Israel. And since that invasion was gradual, now what we've seen on the border of the northern border of Israel and the southern border of Lebanon has been a gradual escalation of those hostilities. In addition, Netanyahu's government has failed the Israeli people. It's believed right now that there could only be as many as 50 or less Israeli and international hostages that could still be alive in Gaza. That means that of the 100 plus hostages that are still supposed to be remaining in Gaza, more than 50% of them have been killed. The vast majority would be killed by Israeli airstrikes. And then the question of, has Hamas been defeated? The main goal of Netanyahu's war, the main goal is the destruction of Hamas. And so what's happening in that regard? Some in the Israeli government have said 50% of Hamas has been defeated. Look, we've been so successful. But now even the Israeli army spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, is saying Hamas is an ideology. We've been saying that since day one. And the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson is literally saying the exact same thing we were saying 9 months ago. He's saying the idea of destroying Hamas is throwing sand in the eyes of the public. I mean, heaven forbid, we're saying the same thing the Israeli Defense Forces are saying. The idea of destroying Hamas is throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. It's a political party. Whoever thinks we can eliminate Hamas is mistaken. This indicates a growing rift between the Israeli army and the Israeli government. All the while, the hostages still remain captive in Gaza. Lord have mercy. And at the same time, let's talk about the suffering and abuses of Palestinian prisoners, beatings, solitary confinement, reports of torture. Look at the pictures of Palestinian prisoners before they went into Israeli military prisons and their weight when they come out. I saw a picture of one of the Tamimi family members who we know well from Nebi Saleh. He was unrecognizable when he was finally released. CMEP just put out a statement yesterday echoing the call of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church in Jerusalem, calling for the release of the 20-something-year-old Layan Nasir, who is a Palestinian Christian young woman, a student at Beer State University, who was arrested on administrative detention. Administrative detention means that Palestinians can be held for up to 10 years without charges or without having any type of due process, no court case. As of mid-April, 3,660 Palestinian prisoners were held under administrative detention without charges or trial or due process. And that's not including all of the Palestinians who have been killed when being accused of perpetrating attacks. No due process. It's assumed that they are perpetrating an attack and they're just indiscriminately killed. More than 520 Palestinians killed in the West Bank since October 7th by Israeli military or settlers. And while Gaza continues hostages and prisoners, the West Bank goes up in flames. Yesterday, it was reported that there was a clear transfer of power happening from the Israeli government to Israeli civilians in the West Bank under Smotrich. And he said, we've created a separate civilian system to deflect international scrutiny so that no one can say we are annexing the West Bank. It's easier to swallow in the international and legal context, so they won't say we're doing annexation here. That was a minister in the Israeli government. Israel is acting with impunity and there is no accountability. And Israel's war has gone on for more than 9 months. Hezbollah leaders have been assassinated, and there's this ongoing struggle between them and the Israeli military ahead. And now Israel is preparing for this war that the US is saying we're going to support. And things are just looking horrific on the horizon. And I'm not going to lie, the blood of this war is on the heads of our American government. And it's being perpetrated by weapons that are made here in the United States. And the US has promised unadulterated support in a war against Hezbollah. What absurdity. And US officials have reassured that we're still supporting the Israeli government. We want security and safety for all people. We want the liberation of the Palestinian people and the end of occupation. But the Israeli government has failed the Israeli people, and we cannot continue to support that government. Andrew Miller, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs, he resigned from the State Department earlier this week. He's been a skeptic of Biden's policies, his bear hug approach towards Netanyahu. It's reported that Miller resigned because of family issues. One cannot help wonder if there is more to the story. And today has been a terribly bloody day in Gaza. At least 42 people were killed in attacks near Gaza City. Now, the Israelis are reporting that it was not Israeli attacks. At least 42 people killed, including 18 in the Tafaf neighborhood in Gaza City, 24 in the Al-Shati refugee camp. A 60-year-old Israeli man was shot in the West Bank in the city of Kalkia. He died this morning. And the Palestinian Health Ministry in Ramallah reported that a 12-year-old boy, Mohammed Murad Kashia, has died after he was seriously wounded by gunfire from the Israeli forces during clashes in Al-Bariya. My prayer today is, Lord, have mercy, Christ have mercy. Today, I'm going to spend the day with my family. It's the 10th anniversary of my father's death. He died because of exposure to Agent Orange during Vietnam. And later on in his life, he came to believe that was a terribly, terribly unjust war. This violence in the Middle East is terribly, terribly unjust. What's happening in Gaza is injustice doesn't even articulate how wrong it is. It is an atrocity against God. So may we do everything in our power to work against it. In the name of Christ, amen.